I wish my dad could have seen these type of cakes, because we couldn't have ever dreamed of making anything like this 10 years ago.
Most people remember Buddy Valastro as the guy who could turn sugar and flour into something that looked like it belonged in a museum. But here's what almost nobody talks about. At the exact moment his empire was at its biggest, the TV deals, the bakery locations, the global brand, everything nearly came apart.
And I started to work hard and try to do it, and I would do a cake, it didn't come out right, I'd redo it. I'd rip off the icing, redo it. Finally, I got good at it.
Not from a business failure, not from a scandal, from something that happened in his own home, on an ordinary afternoon, that left his family reaching for a power saw. That's where this story gets interesting, because what happened next, and how he responded to it, tells you more about Buddy Valastro than 30 seasons of television ever could. The accident nobody saw coming, and the detail that makes it worse. There's a specific detail about Buddy Valastro's 2020 accident that most people who covered it glossed over, and it's the detail that makes the whole thing genuinely hard to process. It wasn't a workplace injury. It wasn't a kitchen accident involving the tools of his trade. It happened in his private bowling alley, the kind of amenity that signals you've made it, on what was supposed to be a quiet afternoon with his family during the pandemic lockdown. The pin-setting machine jammed. Buddy reached in to fix it manually, the way he apparently had before without incident. And then a metal rod, an 1.5 inches thick, drove itself through his dominant right hand and pinned it inside the machine. His teenage sons were home. Buddy Jr. and Marco heard what happened and ran to help. And what followed was not a quick fix. It took them more than 5 minutes and a reciprocating saw to cut through the metal and free their father's hand. 5 minutes is a long time when someone you love is trapped and in that kind of pain. By the time they got him out, the damage was extensive. Bones were crushed, nerves were severed, tendons were torn. He was rushed to hospital and went straight into emergency surgery. But that first surgery was only the beginning. Over the months that followed, Buddy underwent 5 separate operations to reconstruct the hand. Surgeons inserted rods, repaired tendons, and worked to rebuild the fine motor architecture that decades of professional baking had depended on entirely. What made this particular injury so loaded for Buddy, beyond the obvious physical trauma, was the professional identity that lived in that hand. Every sugar flour, every piped border, every sculpted fondant masterpiece he'd produced over a 30-year career had come from those fingers. His hands weren't just tools. They were, in a very real sense, his entire public identity. He later admitted that one thought kept cycling through his mind in the weeks after the accident: that without the ability to decorate, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. That's not self-pity. It's the honest reckoning of someone whose sense of purpose had been physically interrupted, suddenly and without warning, in a way that no amount of business strategy or television charisma could compensate for. He had built an empire with those hands, and now he was lying in a hospital bed wondering whether they would ever work the same way again. The rehabilitation process was long, unglamorous, and genuinely difficult. Physical therapy became a daily commitment. Movements that had once been entirely automatic, gripping a piping bag, manipulating a spatula, applying pressure with precise control, had to be relearned from near scratch. There were setbacks. There were days when progress stalled and the question of a full return felt genuinely uncertain. But Buddy showed up to every session. His wife Lisa was present through all of it, and his children offered the kind of perspective that only family can provide when someone is in the middle of a crisis. By late 2021, he was able to announce that he had recovered roughly 95% of function in his dominant hand. A number that sounds almost complete until you consider what the remaining 5% means to someone whose livelihood depends on precision that most people will never need in their lives. What the cameras never showed. The pressure building long before the accident. Here's something the Cake Boss editors were very good at leaving on the cutting room floor. The version of Buddy Valastro, who was quietly coming apart under the weight of everything he had built. Long before the bowling alley, long before any of the public controversies. Buddy was managing a pressure load that would have overwhelmed most people, and doing it while performing cheerfulness and confidence for a camera crew several days a week. He was born Bartolo Valastro Jr. on March 3, 1977, in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only son among 5 children in a tight-knit Italian-American family anchored by his father's bakery. Carlo's bakery had been purchased by Buddy's father, Bartolo Sr., in 1964, and by the time Buddy was old enough to reach the counter, it had become the center of the family's world. He started working there at 11 years old, not occasionally, consistently. After school, on weekends, absorbing techniques and developing the instincts that would later become his professional foundation. Then, in 1994, his father was diagnosed with lung cancer. Buddy was 17. Within a short time, Bartolo Sr. was gone, and Buddy, a teenager with no formal culinary training and no business education, became responsible for keeping the bakery alive. He had made a promise to his father before the end, that he would turn Carlo's bakery into something people knew about. That promise became the operating principle of the next 2 decades of his life. He delivered on it. The cakes got more elaborate. The reputation spread beyond Hoboken. Wedding publications started featuring his work, and in 2007, an appearance on Food Network Challenge introduced him to a national audience for the first time. Producers saw something that went beyond baking ability. They saw the family, the drama, the tradition, and the relentless energy of a man running a high-pressure business surrounded by people he loved and argued with in equal measure. 2 years later, in 2009, Cake Boss premiered on TLC. The show was an immediate success. It ran in over 200 countries. Carlo's Bakery transformed from a Hoboken institution into an international tourist destination, with fans lining up for hours just to stand inside the space they had seen on television. And Buddy, responding to the momentum, expanded aggressively. More than 18 bakery locations across the United States, a full-service Italian restaurant in Las Vegas, a fast-casual pizza concept in Nevada, consumer product lines in Walmart and Target, multiple spin-off television series, a brand that seemed to have no ceiling. But here's what was happening behind all of that. By the time he was in his late 20s, Buddy was already experiencing panic attacks severe enough to land him in the emergency room. He has spoken about this openly in later years. The first episode hit him at 27 and was serious enough that he couldn't simply walk it off. For a man whose entire public image was built on confidence and control, these moments felt, by his own account, like failure. He sought help quietly. He didn't discuss it publicly for years. The toll of running a television franchise, managing a growing business empire, maintaining the family dynamic that the show depended on, and raising 4 children simultaneously was real and cumulative. Cake Boss made it look fun because that's what the format required. But the version of Buddy Valastro that audiences didn't see was someone carrying a substantial amount of weight, mostly alone, for a very long time. The controversies that tested him publicly and what they actually cost him. By the mid-2010s, Buddy Valastro had spent years building a reputation as one of the most wholesome figures in American food television. Family man. Hard worker. Italian-American tradition. The kind of image that makes networks comfortable and advertisers happy. And then, within a few years, that image took damage from multiple directions simultaneously. The most publicly visible incident came in November of 2014. In the early hours of the morning, New York City police officers pulled Buddy over on 10th Avenue after observing his vehicle moving erratically between lanes. He was given a field sobriety test. He failed it. He was arrested for driving while intoxicated, and his license was temporarily suspended. The arrest made headlines quickly, partly because of who he was, and partly because of what he reportedly said during the stop, that he had consumed a couple of drinks, and seemed to suggest that his public profile should insulate him from the consequences. The quote became a talking point. TLC created distance from the incident publicly. Fans who had grown up watching him as a symbol of reliability and family values were caught between disappointment and confusion. Buddy issued an apology within days. It was direct, he expressed genuine remorse, and he didn't attempt to minimize what had happened. He later described the arrest as a turning point, not just in terms of public relations, but personally. He has spoken about the degree to which the incident forced him to examine habits and patterns he had been avoiding examining. The wake-up call framing wasn't spin. It appeared to be accurate, given that no comparable incident followed. 2 years before the DWI, in 2012, a different kind of controversy had surfaced around the show itself. An episode of Cake Boss featured a segment involving Carmen Carrera, a well-known transgender model who had appeared on RuPaul's Drag Race. The premise involved one of Buddy's family members being set up in what amounted to a prank at Carrera's expense, one that relied on her transgender identity as the punchline. Carrera came forward publicly to say she had been misled about the nature of her appearance on the show and that the way she had been used was demeaning. The response was swift and significant. Advocacy groups called out the segment explicitly. The episode was pulled from rotation. Buddy issued a public apology and acknowledged that the segment should never have been made. By the standards of 2012, the accountability was relatively prompt. By any standard, the incident represented a failure of judgment, not necessarily Buddy's alone, since producers designed these segments, but the public face of the show absorbed the consequence regardless. And then there was the grief, which wasn't a controversy, but was perhaps the most privately defining event of the entire period. In 2017, Buddy's mother Mary passed away. She had been battling ALS for several years, and fans of the show had watched her decline with the kind of helpless affection that audiences develop for people they have watched in their homes for years. Mama Mary was not a peripheral figure in the Cake Boss universe. She was its emotional center. Her presence carried the history of the family, the weight of the father Buddy had lost at 17, the continuity of everything the bakery represented. Her death hit Buddy in a way that was visible to anyone watching his public appearances in the years that followed. He spoke about her constantly, not performatively, but in the way people do when they are still genuinely working through a loss. Losing both parents by the time you're in your early 40s, while managing a public life that requires you to project warmth and stability continuously, is a particular kind of difficult that doesn't show up in ratings or revenue figures. The empire he built, and the parts of it most people forgot about. Before things got complicated, Buddy Valastro did something genuinely rare. He took a regional bakery in Hoboken, New Jersey, and turned it into a legitimate global brand through the force of his own personality and an almost unreasonable willingness to work. The scale of what Carlo's Bakery became in the decade following Cake Boss's premiere is easy to underestimate if you think of it primarily as a television show. It was that, but it was also a business operation that expanded across multiple industries simultaneously. At its peak, Buddy was managing more than 18 bakery locations across the United States. A full-service Italian restaurant called Buddy V's Ristorante in Las Vegas that drew heavily on his mother's recipes, and a fast-casual pizza concept in Nevada aimed at a different consumer profile than the custom cake clientele. The retail expansion ran parallel to the physical locations. Buddy launched a line of consumer baking products, branded turntables, piping bags, cake mixes, and specialty tools that appeared in major retailers including Walmart and Target. The logic was straightforward. The show had created an audience of home bakers who wanted to engage with what they watched, and a product line gave them a way to do that without visiting a bakery. He also published several cookbooks that combined family history with practical instruction, which sold well precisely because the audience already knew and cared about the family. The television side expanded beyond Cake Boss into a suite of spin-off programming. Next Great Baker put aspiring bakers in competition for a position at Carlo's. Kitchen Boss shifted the format toward home cooking and family meals. Buddy's Bakery Rescue followed a well-established reality television template of an expert visiting struggling businesses to help turn them around. And Buddy vs. Duff paired him against Duff Goldman of Ace of Cakes in a competitive format that allowed both men to demonstrate technical skill while giving the audience the rivalry narrative they had been curious about for years. That last show resolved something interesting. For a long time, the framing of Buddy and Duff as rivals had been primarily a media construction. Neither man had aggressively fed the narrative, but neither had publicly dismissed it either. When the competition series actually brought them together, what emerged was more complex than rivalry. They were genuinely different kinds of cake artists. Buddy rooted in the Italian-American bakery tradition, Duff coming from a fine art and sculpture background, and the respect that developed on camera appeared to be real. Buddy acknowledged Goldman's skill without qualification. Goldman returned the assessment. It was one of the more honest moments either show produced. Throughout all of this expansion, Buddy kept the family structure at the center of the operation. His sisters remained involved. His wife Lisa, largely behind the scenes in the early seasons, became a more visible presence as the show continued and as the family matured on camera. His brother-in-law, Mauro Castano, and Joey Fagno remained core figures. The show's premise, that Carlo's Bakery was genuinely a family business in the traditional sense, not a marketing construction, held because it was accurate. Where he actually is now, and what the new chapter looks like. After the accident, the recoveries, the controversies, and the grief, a version of Buddy Valastro emerged that was different from the one who had opened the first episode of Cake Boss in 2009. Still recognizable, still driven, but quieter about it. More selective, more aware of what the pace of the previous 15 years had actually cost him. The professional comeback took shape gradually. In 2023, Buddy returned to television in a new series called Buddy Valastro's Cake Dynasty. The premise was built around legacy rather than spectacle. Where Cake Boss had been about Buddy's energy and the controlled chaos of a high-volume custom bakery, Cake Dynasty centered on what comes next. Specifically, the question of who carries Carlo's Bakery forward when Buddy steps back. His children are central to the new show in a way that reflects both where he is personally and what he learned from losing his own father young. His daughter Sophia and sons Buddy Jr., Marco and Carlo have taken on real roles within the business. learning from the ground up the way Buddy once did under his father's instruction. The show captures that transfer of knowledge and responsibility in real time, which gives it a different emotional texture than the earlier series. The business itself has changed shape. A number of Carlo's Bakery physical locations that had opened during the expansion years quietly closed in the post-pandemic period, particularly in secondary markets where the foot traffic that had sustained them was no longer there. Rather than treating the closures as a retreat, Buddy repositioned the business around a direct-to-consumer digital model, an online store shipping cakes, pastries, and DIY kits directly to customers across the country. The shift reflected a realistic assessment of where consumer behavior had moved, and what a brand like Carlo's could sustain profitably without the television exposure that had originally driven walk-in traffic to the satellite locations. But the most symbolically significant development came in 2024, with the opening of a flagship Carlo's Bakery location in Times Square. The choice of location was deliberate. Times Square is not a neighborhood bakery destination. It's a statement. After everything the previous 4 years had involved, Buddy planting a flag in one of the most visible commercial spaces in the world was a very specific kind of message about where he believed the brand stood. The new location reflects the updated version of Carlo's as a concept. The traditional products that built the reputation alongside newer elements designed for the current consumer, including vending machines, dispensing bakery items, and a space designed with social media documentation in mind. It's a bakery that understands the world it's operating in, which is a different posture from the Hoboken original that became famous precisely for feeling untouched by modern commercial calculation. Buddy himself has been candid about the lingering physical reality of his hand. The 95% recovery figure he cited in 2021 remains roughly accurate, but the remaining limitation is one he has learned to work around rather than eliminate. Certain decorating tasks that once came automatically now require assistance or adaptation. He has responded by shifting more of his personal energy toward the design and development side of the business, conceiving cakes and training the next generation to execute them, rather than insisting on being the hands-on decorator he was for the first 30 years of his career. That adjustment, more than anything else in his recent history, captures what Buddy Valastro has actually become. Not the cake boss of the early TLC years, performing superhuman productivity for a camera, but the architect of something he intends to outlast him, a family business, a brand, and a set of skills being passed carefully from one generation to the next, the same way they were passed to him by a father he lost far too soon. Buddy Valastro's story is not a comeback story in the conventional sense. He never fully left. What changed is what he came back as. Someone who had been through enough to understand the difference between building a brand and building something that actually lasts. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.